and morphological categories using the experimental method of artificial language learning. And today she will present her work titled Language Universals in Individual Minds, Experimental Tests on Linguistic Hypotheses. So, Jennifer, welcome. So the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. I wouldn't say this is my typical audience, so I'm very much curious to hear what you all have to say. I think there's very clear connections in my mind between this work and the kind of computational modeling this community does. So yeah, like I said, be very interested to hear your input. Okay, so my research is fundamentally interested in understanding why we see so-called typological universals. So here's perhaps the best known one. This is Greenberg's first universal, and it has to do with how how languages order the kind of basic elements in a declarative phrase. So do you have subject, verb, object, or subject, object, verb, or one of the other possibilities? And it was noticed since Greenberg, at least, that some of these patterns are more common than others. So SVO and SOV are really the predominant patterns, and the other ones are not so common. So yeah, linguistics work and cognitive science work for a long time has been interested in understanding why these kind of typological generalizations hold. So why? Why do they hold, and why do we care? Well, first of all, these are very tantalising patterns, but they reflect probably a lot of different factors. So one of the tricky parts in investigating them is to tease these factors apart. So we know that these distributions of languages are affected by history. So the history of the languages themselves and accidents of history around, politics and and war and lots of stuff, okay? We also know that these patterns can be shaped by the social and physical world. They can also be shaped by processes of language change, so what happens to languages as they kind of pass through the channel of communication. And also they can be due to features of perception and cognition. And the latter one is really the one that has been, of most interest to cognitive scientists, myself included. So the cognitive science perspective is to ask, well, what kinds of mechanisms or representations of human language play into shaping those distributions? So in my own work, I'm most interested in understanding whether these reflect kind of cognitive universals, so features that all human minds share. But it's a little bit tricky to do that. So because these universals reflect so many different factors, we can't tell just by looking at them what's really the underlying cause or causes. Now, the traditional approach from linguistics for many years has been to kind of infer that there are linguistic constraints, so constraints on our linguistic representations or linguistic learning mechanisms directly from those that typological data. But obviously that's problematic. So typology is not causal evidence, and obviously the chain of causation goes the other way. So in this talk, I'm going to tell you about a program of research that tries to dig into individual minds and the behaviors of individual minds in order to make better causal theories of how cognition influences typology. So here I'm going to talk about two really quite different language universals. I'm putting universals in quotes because, as you can see from my example, these are trends rather than kind of universal features of language. The first one is around nominal word order, and the second one is around person systems. And for each of those, I'm going to tell you about some experimental evidence, in each case inspired by linguistic theories of typology, but testing links to cognitive mechanisms. And I'll sort of highlight throughout the importance of looking across human minds, not just at the kind of typical English-speaking population. Okay, and these experiments will be very much interested in probing the kind of nature and origins of the mechanisms. Okay, so let's dive right in. We can start with complex noun phrase word order. So if I were in Kenya, if I were in a place called Tharaka, and I was speaking to you in Kitharaka, the language of the Tharaka people, and I was lucky enough to see these adorable monkeys, I might say something to you like Maguna mama mairi matongi, and that would mean something like these two adorable monkeys. But Kitharaka and English have different ways of ordering these phrases. So in Kitharaka, you have the noun first, followed by the demonstrative, then the numeral, then the adjective. In English, you have quite a different order. So the demonstrative comes first, then the numeral, then the adjective, then the noun. So if we look at a distribution of these languages, and I can't show you one on a nice map because that doesn't exist at this point, but I can just show you the kind of frequency distribution. And these two patterns fall in kind of different areas of the frequency space. So English is quite a common pattern, not the most common pattern. Kitharaka is relatively rare. And this is something that has been discussed in the linguistics literature and the typology literature for quite some time, because people have noticed that there's a particular type of word order that's really quite common. So the types of word order are ones that are in blue, and I can characterize them for you using this little schema. So this is the most common word orders, noun phrase word orders. So 80% of languages in the sample that the biggest sample we currently have one of these patterns. And they can be characterized by having the adjective closest to the noun and the demonstrative farthest away, and the numeral sort of in between. So these are kind of schematic drawings that kind of show you that the adjective and the noun is sort of nested together right in the middle, and the demonstrative is more peripheral. So a linguistic theory has been derived to explain this typological data, and it posits a kind of universal or innate sort of underlying structure of the noun phrase. So if you've not seen one of these, like since your intro to linguistics class, if you ever had it, this is a syntactic tree, but it doesn't itself determine linear order. It's just a structure. So you can flip around any of the nodes on that tree. So for example, if you want to derive this one here, you can just read off the words as they are, like these two cute monkeys. If you want to derive this one, you just flip all the nodes in the tree, and you can derive, for example, monkeys cute to these. Okay, but you can't use this without messing up any of the branches to derive the Kitharaka order, for example. So monkeys, these two cute, can't be read off this tree. You have to mess around with more stuff. Okay, so the idea is orders that are kind of transparently derived from this underlying structure are preferred. So there are additional linguistic constraints that are designed to rule out other exceptions, but this is the kind of general idea that I'm going to be investigating. So is it really the case that orders transparently derived from this structure are preferred by human minds? Now, in reality, of course, this data is really not particularly reliable. So for example, if you look at genera rather than languages, the skew is still there, but it's not very impressive. We just don't have that much data. So it's perfectly possible that it's kind of a spurious difference between these patterns, and almost all possible orders in the noun phrase are tested in some language. So it's something important to actually dig into. Okay, so I've been working on this particular universal for a embarrassingly long time. So I'll give you a little bit of a history. So I first started investigating it by asking whether English speakers prefer this kind of order. So they do. And across a bunch of papers, we found that kind of regardless of the sort of particulars of the paradigm you use, English speakers will make inferences about a new language that are kind of that follow this kind of underlying structure. So for example, if we train people on a language that has English speakers on a language that has post-nominal modifiers rather than pre-nominal modifiers, so they have to learn a kind of unusual pattern from the perspective of their native language. So they might learn something like iti himi, and across the experiment they need to learn that iti is the word for feathers and himi is a word for a proximal demonstrative. Or they might see iti puku, so that would mean a red feather. So we train them on this, but we don't actually tell them how the modifiers are relative to one another. So at test, we ask them to describe something where they need to produce a noun and an adjective and a demonstrative. And the question is, what order are they going to use for that? Now, sorry, I have a little bit of a cold still. It wouldn't be such a crazy thing to imagine that what English speakers do is just use the linear order of modifiers in English, but stick it after the noun. That would be consistent with the training that they've had, and it wouldn't be crazy from the perspective of the bigram statistics of English. So maybe they'll say something like iti, himi, puku. Our thinking was that they would not do that. Rather, they would follow the kind of hierarchical order of modifiers in English. So they would do this flip that I was showing you, where you flip everything around, and you produce something like iti, puku, himi, where the adjective is closest to the noun and the demonstrative is more peripheral. Okay. So I'll show you what they do. This is from one of our papers. So these are individual participants, and if they're up at the top, that means they're always producing this kind of hierarchy following order. If they do the opposite, that means they're producing the linear order of modifiers in English, and most people go with the hierarchy following order. Okay, so that's interesting, and it's kind of a good sanity check. So it suggests that when people are learning a new language and making inferences about its word order, they're not they're sensitive to something like the hierarchical structure that their language has. But of course, what we really want to know is whether everyone has this kind of hierarchical structure in their head, or something like this hierarchical structure in their head. And so the best population to look at for that, barring one that has no language at all, is one that has a language that doesn't follow the hierarchy at all. So I showed you before that Kitaraka has a word order that can't really be derived by that hierarchy. So it could be derived by a different hierarchy, or it could be derived by something more complex than that hierarchy. But it was particularly interesting to see whether speakers of this language nevertheless infer an order that's consistent with this posited hierarchy, so with the adjective closest to the noun rather than the demonstrative closest to the noun. So we did the same experiment more recently with this speaker population. So the experiment is really quite similar, except for since these are speakers of a language that has post-nominal modifiers, we teach them a language with pre-nominal modifiers, so they would learn that the order is kimi iti and puku iti. And then again, we ask them, what would you do if you have to describe this one? And our expectation is that they should produce something like demonstrative adjective noun. Now, because this is English order, we are expecting them to derive. They had better not be speakers of English, and they are not. So these are monolingual Kitaraka speakers. In order to do that, we have to test older speakers who were around before education in English was widely happening in Kenya. So it's quite a difficult experiment to collect data for, and it took ages and ages. And of course, it was during COVID. But we did finally get this data, and you can see what it looks like. So there's a reminder of the English speakers, and here's what the Kitaraka speakers look like. So they do just the same as English speakers in terms of assuming that this kind of hierarchy following order is in place with the adjective closest to the noun and not the demonstrative. Okay. So that's some elements of this linguistically informed theory supported by artificial language learning experiments. So there's some evidence that something like this kind of structure is present across different human minds. So orders generated directly from this kind of structure are preferred. Now, you might have been wondering or bristling, or depending on your theoretical predilections, you might have been thinking, but this hierarchy doesn't exist. This is crazy. Sorry. And of course, there's an open question, like, what is this? What is this structure? What is it, a syntactic structure that people have in their heads, or is it something different? And I'm going to try to show you that it's probably not a syntactic hierarchy per se. Instead, I'm going to argue that it's connected to meaning. So let's talk a little bit about the nature and origins of this structure. So if I show you a picture like this one, and I ask you what color might it be, it is very easy for you to answer. Unless you've been really used to seeing unripe bananas, you probably think they're yellow. If I asked you instead, like, how many bananas might I likely to be having? Am I likely to have 1 banana, 2 bananas, 3 bananas, 4 bananas, 5 bananas? You might be less certain. You probably know, like, the kind of magnitude, right? I'm not likely to have like a bushel full of bananas, but not going to be likely to associate a banana that specifically with the numerosity. What about location of bananas relative to a speaker? Do you mind talking about bananas that are close to me, far away from me? Am I specifying that? So the point of this little exercise is to show you that objects and their properties, things that we convey using adjectives like color or texture, are often very closely associated with the objects themselves. So they're kind of often inherent properties of the objects. Not always, but often. By contrast, numerosities are sometimes closely associated with objects, so sometimes there are things that come in pairs or low numerosities or high numerosities, but not a very specific association. And words that we convey words that we use to convey things like discourse status or location relative to the speaker, so that's demonstratives, they're really designed not to be closely associated with particular objects. They're really flexible in that way. This banana, that banana, they're kind of designed to be, not set properties of objects. Okay, so the idea is that the hierarchy is based on this. It's based on the closeness of association between objects in the world and particular properties that we happen to convey using linguistic categories. All right, so if we want to kind of probe that and see, well, does this underlying structure kind of reflect differences in conceptual closeness? Well, one way of kind of quantifying that and seeing, okay, is it actually true that adjectives tend to be more closely associated with, or properties tend to be more closely associated with objects than numerosities, and things we convey using demonstratives are not very closely associated. Well, we can do that using mutual information. So I'm sure you all in the room know what this is. So it basically tells us whether the co-occurrence frequency of pairs of things is higher than expected given the individual frequencies of those elements alone. So what we did is look across corpora of a lot of different languages and see whether it is in fact the case that mutual information between nouns and adjectives is the highest and nouns and demonstratives is the lowest. So here's what it looks like for English, and this prediction is indeed borne out. So this is the UD tree bank data from English. So you can see some examples of high PMI things. They're really like sort of set phrases that go together, like dense vegetation. You just hear that a lot. And low PMI things are like, as you would expect, right? That child, there's nothing in particular about a child that makes you want to describe it as that versus this. So that's what they are. And then if we look across a bunch of languages, you can see the same kind of pattern where adjectives and nouns have the highest PMI and demonstratives and nouns have the lowest PMI. And that includes the childless corpora, which is interesting because the idea is that this is something that would be learned from your experience in the world. You would come to have this expectation, and then it would influence your kind of conceptual structure of the world, and that in turn has the potential to influence how you build up a syntactic structure or a linearization of that conceptual structure once you've learned the relevant categories in your language. Now, of course, what would have been ideal for this study would have been to use like an image database or something where we actually are looking at mutual information of objects and properties. So at the time that I did this study, no such thing existed. And I feel sure that it will exist at some point, but for the time being, I think it's actually really difficult to have these particular categories coded in image databases. So please tell me if you know otherwise. But because we were using text, this opens up the possibility that it isn't conceptual closeness at all. Rather, it's something like dependency locality. So maybe ordering preferences are shaped by how often you actually hear like words together and nothing to do with world information at all. So that's definitely possible, and I can't rule it out at this point. And in fact, I would be surprised if this isn't part of the story as well. It certainly would reinforce it. But one thing we can do is ask, well, what order is preferred when syntax and words are not really at issue at all? Okay. So one way to do this using experiments is to use a different kind of paradigm called silent gesture. So in silent gesture experiments, what you do is show people an image and you ask them to convey the contents of that image using their hands and not words. So they're not tapping into conventionalized linguistic units at all. They're just using their hands to play a kind of improvised game of charades. And we can ask, in this kind of situation, where do they place the different elements that they need to convey? So in this experiment, what happens is people are sitting at a table and there's two iPads, one that's close to them and one that's far away from them, and a picture comes up like this one, and then they have to use their hands to convey that image. So hopefully you see the video, and maybe it's choppy. So you can imagine to yourself how you would go about gesturing that. But this particular participant indicates which iPad it's on, what it is, that it has stripes, that there are 4 of them. Here's another one. So it's a pencil, got spots on it, 4 of them on this iPad here. Okay, and you might have noticed that those 2 are both different orders. They're not the typical order of complex modification in English, but they do contain gestures where the noun and the adjective are right next to each other and the noun and the demonstrative are not. And we can look across participants, and that is in general what they do. So there is actually a preferred order here. So you can ask me about that if you want. But most of the orders that participants produce, because they're not always consistent in what they do, have this structure where the noun is closest to the adjective and the demonstrative is farthest away. So that's some little bit of evidence that maybe this is not necessarily something just about the statistics of words, but something about how this information tends to be packaged. Okay. So to summarize that part of the talk, the argument is that people may learn from the world about how different objects and their properties tend to work and tend to be associated with one another. They form a kind of conceptual structure that's based on this. This influences the linearization patterns that they prefer and leads to the typology. So elements of a kind of theory that are supported by these experiments. So some kind of underlying structure, I'm arguing here, that it has a particular nature. Orders transparently derived from this are preferred. It might be that it's derived from conceptual knowledge. So we still have a bunch of ongoing experiments where we're trying to see whether we can flexibly move around people's conceptual knowledge and influence the order they produce on the basis of that. So that's the kind of next steps in this set of studies. Okay, now for something completely different. So I'm going to switch away from word order, my favorite domain, and move to person systems, which is a domain I've always found very interesting and very rich, but much trickier in some ways to get at using experiments. So person systems. So these are systems. So often they're mapped onto pronouns. For example, in languages of the world, you also see person features encoded on verbs. But we're going to focus on pronouns here. So this is approximately what we think is the sort of meaning space underlying this domain. So you have speech roles. So that indicates what role is a participant playing in the discourse. Are they the speaker? Are they the addressee? Are they another person who's not particularly involved in the discussion? And this interacts with number. So, for example, in English, the speaker is indicated by I in the singular. Oops, all my animations are messed up. The second person is you in English. The third person, wow, okay, sorry, my animations are all kinds of messed up. So you've got this first person, second person, and third person. If you look beyond English, there's evidence of another category. So for example, if you're a speaker of Chinese, you might know that there's an additional kind of distinction which often is used to encode the difference between groups that include the speaker but not the addressee and groups that include both the speaker and the addressee. So a meaning that encodes the speaker but not the addressee is called the exclusive. So often called first-person exclusive. And the other one that includes the addressee is called the inclusive. So this is what the space generally looks like. And if you look across the world's languages, this is probably very small for you guys, so sorry if you can't see this crazy map. So you can imagine there's many, many, many ways that a language could partition this space into pronouns, right? And English has some interesting homophony patterns. For example, we don't have a distinction between the inclusive and exclusive meanings, and we just say we. We also have some funny patterns of number homophony. So, for example, we don't have a distinction between second person singular and second person plural. That's really very rare across the world's languages. Nevertheless, of the possible ways of partitioning this space, only a very small number of them are actually attested. So you see some examples here across a bunch of different languages. But you can also see a couple of patterns over on the right-hand side that are unattested. And we can call these the second inclusive and the third inclusive. So these are paradigms where the inclusive is homophonous with a different form than it is in English. So, for example, in English, you've got this homophony pattern where everything that has the speaker gets folded into this one term, we. But these other two patterns just aren't attested. So there is no language that has a form of you that also includes the inclusive form, and there is no language that has a form of they that also includes the inclusive form. Okay, so that's known as Wiki's observation because it's something that he noticed, and a lot of linguists have worked on sort of understanding the features of this domain in a way that can predict features of the typology, this observation included. So, for example, a bunch of researchers have proposed different kinds of sort of universal constraints on person systems based on a feature space. So, for example, one possible way of distinguishing this, which I've kind of adopted here because it's a sort of default, is that there's plus minus speaker, plus minus addressee, and plus minus other. And you can combine these things in different ways and get different partitions. And one idea is that there's something particularly special about the speaker feature. So maybe it's weighted more highly in people's representations than these other features. Now, how that explains Wiki's observation? Well, if you think about it, you might have thought that, well, the third person inclusive is just crazy, right? Why would you have a homophony pattern of that kind, right? The third person, which is expressing others, doesn't share any features with the inclusive, right? The inclusive has the speaker and the addressee in it. There's no overlap there. So that's kind of an odd non-feature-based homophony. But the addressee, the second person, in principle, there isn't any reason why that ought to be a better homophony, a worse homophony pattern than the first person homophony. So in both cases, they share a feature. If you have homophony with the first person, it shares the speaker feature. If you have homophony with the second person, it shares the addressee feature. So you've got to do something in your theory to make it so that one of those homophony patterns happens and the other one doesn't. And typically that has something to do with weighting the speaker feature. Okay. So I've done a number of artificial language learning experiments on person systems to try to see whether there is something special about the speaker feature. These are quite complicated experiments, and I'm not going to try to tell you about them today. I'm going to focus on another paradigm, but I will tell you that we do artificial language learning experiments where we teach people either an English-like system where it's a first inclusive, or a second person inclusive system, or a third person inclusive system. And what we find is that first person inclusive is pretty easy to learn. That makes sense. These are English speakers who we have as participants, and it should be easy for them to learn. But the second person inclusive is also relatively easy for them to learn, so it's not particularly problematic. The third inclusive, perhaps not surprisingly, is not acquired well by people in artificial language learning experiments. So we have lots of evidence for that kind of preference for feature-based homophony. So patterns like first or second inclusive as opposed to third person inclusive, but less evidence from those experiments that there's something special about the speaker. So I want to show you about another kind of experiment that we've been using to try to find evidence for this kind of specialness of the speaker feature. Okay, so what would it mean to have evidence for this kind of primacy of this feature, So what we've been looking at is actually biased representations of this space. So if you had a kind of bias in representational space, what would that look like? It basically means that you have a preference for grouping together meanings that include the speaker feature. So for example, if I have all of the possible meanings in this space, I want to keep together the ones that have the speaker and keep distinct the ones that don't have the speaker. So here's a way of thinking about that similarity space. What do I think is more similar to what in this space? Well, I think the things that have the speaker in them are more similar to one another, and I think things that don't have the speaker in them are more similar to one another. But there are lots of other potential biases in this representational space. So it could be that I like to that I like to keep together things that have the addressee, or things that have another, or things that have one of the direct participants in the discourse, that is the speaker and the addressee, and I think other things are quite similar to one another. I could also think about this space in terms of number. So maybe I have a preference to think that things that are singular are more similar to one another to things that are plural, or dual even. Or it could be even that I think there's something special about the inclusive, and those things are are more similar to one another. So there's lots of ways that this space could be represented that could encode some kind of preference in terms of the similarity structure. So we want to know which one of these which one of these schematics is a good representation for what people actually have in their minds. And to do that, we look at representational similarity across a bunch of participant populations. So we look at English speakers, Spanish speakers, Vietnamese speakers, Slovenian speakers, and Mandarin speakers. So this is an interesting selection because it includes speakers that have an inclusive versus exclusive distinction in their grammar, and also speakers that have singular versus plural versus dual, which is not something that is particularly common across the world's languages, but it does happen. So this is our set of participant populations, and oops, I have not included I've missed out a slide, sorry about that. But what we actually ask people to do in this experiment is sort things. I'll take you back to this picture. Sort things that are just presented on the screen on cards. And so the things, they essentially just look like these little guys. So what they see is a kind of assortment of these little dudes talking to each other and some others hanging around. It's a little GIF. It doesn't have any language in the speech bubble. You just see some funny looking characters. So you know that one of the guys is talking to the other guy and there's some others hanging around. We randomize the color and the position of them all. And then we show them a bunch of cards that has some of the participants highlighted and others sort of made opaque, just the way it looks here. And they see all of those cards and they have to sort them successively. So they sort them first into 2 groups, and then each of those groups they sort until there's only 2 cards left in a pile. And so that basically allows us to see which one of these meanings they find most similar to another. So we'll get a representation that just looks like potentially one of these. Okay. So here is what we get from each of these participant populations. So they've done their successive sorting, and then we average across all the participants in one of these populations. And then we can ask, is there evidence that there's a kind of universal representation of this similarity space across these speaker populations? So we can show, for example, that all of these similarity matrices are highly correlated with one another. So we have evidence that there is a kind of single similarity space. It's very it's quite fuzzy, so it's hard to see exactly what the structure of the space is, but we do get very similar sorting patterns across all these populations. So then we can take this kind of average similarity space and have a think about which one of the potential ways of kind of determining what's more similar to what are these participants looking like. So to do that, we take each individual person's similarity matrix, and we ask which of these potential biased underlying representations is their similarity matrix more similar to. So we do that using a clustering algorithm, and then we can ask for each of these speaker populations, what do they tend to sort on the basis of? And you can see here that most people tend to sort on the basis of speaker. So their similarity space, their similarity matrix is most similar to this kind of speaker biased underlying representation, and less similar to these other ones. So not everyone sorts that way. And you can see some people sort in a way that looks more like the participant cluster, and some people by the addressee cluster, and some people are clustering based on something we don't know what they're doing. But there's definitely a bias here. So we definitely see more people sorting based on the speaker one, and that happens across our populations. Okay. So basically the idea here is people have this meaning space, but it isn't just, so each individual feature in that space isn't sort of treated equally. Across languages, there's something special about the speaker feature that makes people perceive things that categories that involve the speaker as more similar to one another than the other categories. And that in turn influences how people are likely to partition the space in their pronominal systems. So in this instance, we've been focusing on this particular feature, the inclusive, and what does it get, what homophony patterns does it participate in. So this kind of preference for the speaker could lead, for example, to first inclusive systems being more common than the other two. So across these experiments, we see some evidence that there's a kind of universal feature-based similarity space, and it has a kind of speaker bias in it. It's not super strong, it's relatively weak, but it's enough that it should change the way the typology works. Now, one thing that's interesting is that you can imagine that in the pronominal space, it's not just like how does this underlying representation work that's going to affect how people partition the space. So, for example, we can take this theory and sort of embed it in a bigger theory of efficient communication. So, for example, if we're interested in the information bottleneck approaches, we can see this as a process by which languages optimize a trade-off between compression and informativeness. So, for example, complexity is something like the number of bits required to communicate a meaning. Accuracy is something like the similarity between speaker's intended meaning and a listener's inferred meaning. Now, in models like this, the optimization process really depends a lot on the representation of the space. So this is, for example, some work by Noga Zavslavsky on color systems. So how do languages partition color systems? And here, it's very important that we understand the kind of psychometric properties of how people perceive color. So what colors are perceived as more similar to one another than other colors. And that influences what partitions of the space we predict to be more optimal. So if we're looking to see whether languages look more optimal than they would by chance, we need to have that underlying representation of the space in order to do that well. And we can do the exact same thing with this kind of similarity matrix that we've now derived from a bunch of different speaker populations. So we can plug that into a model of efficient communication like this and see, does that do a good job of predicting the typology of number systems, of person systems? So do we see languages looking more close to this optimal frontier than they would if they were generated by chance, if we use this kind of empirically derived similarity space? So that's what we've been working on recently, and spoiler alert, the answer is yes. So it's good to use this empirically derived representation of similarity. Okay. So this is now a kind of empirically supported theory of person systems. So here you have this sort of gradient feature-based similarity space, just like you would have for any other kind of semantic space. But this is one where it's been a little bit more difficult to actually get at what does the underlying similarity space really look like than something like color, where you can just ask people, look, here's two color chips, tell me which one is more similar to the other. So in this space, we have found evidence for a speaker bias. If we combine that with a sort of independently motivated model of communication, then that helps us to predict features of person systems. Okay, so just coming back a bit to the bigger picture, the idea here is that if we want to link typological universals to features of human cognition, we need linguistically sophisticated but experimentally informed theories of how this actually works. So we may end up finding that there are features of our linguistic system, features of our cognitive or perceptual system, facts about the world, that all kind of play into shaping those distributions. And evidence for or against particular causal links can come from cross-cultural experiments. So if we want to understand the kind of underlying features of human cognition or perception that shape the space, then we need to be looking across populations of humans to make sure that whatever is happening in one population is not happening just because of their language experience or their world experience, but is something that's present across humans. And these same experiments can also be used to probe the nature of the representation. So in the nominal domain, I tried to argue that those representations are based on our understanding of meaning of objects in the world. And it happens to be that those meanings are conveyed by linguistic categories, but our organization of that space is influenced by what we know about the world. In the person domain, again, the idea is that that's something that's very linguistic. So pronouns are kind of impossible to disattach. That's not the word. Impossible to disentangle from language, right? They're about speakers and addressees and others. But we can use these kind of sorting paradigms to see, in the absence of language, how do people perceive similarities between those underlying meanings. Now, I also think there's a clear role for modeling here, because if you want to understand how individual human minds actually influence typology, that's quite a link. So you need to understand how those individual level biases get amplified at the level of populations in order to actually influence typology. So it has been historically very useful to kind of simulate that process where individual level cognitive biases come to be amplified over time and influence typology. That has been historically very perhaps most clearly shown in modeling. You can't really do that in experiments. At the same time, I think there's a lot of evidence. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity for kind of probing a bit more the nature of the underlying representations using language models. So, for example, we can't really ask, like, what would happen in a human mind if they only have certain types of experience and not other types of experience. But that is something we can potentially do using language models. So, for example, we can take away parts of the language model's experience with language and simulate what happens if they don't have that kind of experience. So what if you have a language model that's never seen any combinations of complex nominal modifiers? You can see, well, what kind of evidence do those models use in order to make inferences about word order under those circumstances? So that's not something you can really do using human participants, but something that you can do using models. So, like I said, I think there's lots of potential connections, and I'm curious to hear what you all think. Okay, that's it. So thanks very much, and here's my collaborators on various strands of this work.